Yo, what's going on, everybody? This is Nothing But Bangers, aka MBB, aka Bangers, aka I've got a incredible recap, including the first place finisher player interview ready for you in this video. We're going to be talking about a lot of decks that just got top cut in the Ursiiday Pocket Weekly Tournament. And again, it's going to be something that is really diverse. We've got an incredible metagame shaping up right now, along with the introduction of Rank this past week. So this is going to be a banger of a video. Let's get to it. This format so far has been very diverse. Granted, we are still very new into this format, especially with all of these new cards, but it was really cool to see a Giratina Mewtwo deck take home first place. This was a deck concept that we actually cooked live on stream after the full set was reviewed, and it's really cool to see how well we were able to kind of pinpoint some very key strategies. If you tuned into that live stream, you might remember some of those decks, and who knows what else we cooked on that stream might end up becoming a real deck. But it was really cool to see that. And again, I do have the first place finisher interview towards the end of this video, so stay tuned for that. But looking at this breakdown of some of these top decks, I mean, this is just super diverse. I mean, I know that a lot of people are kind of complaining about how, the Giratina Darkrai Giratina deck, the play pattern is like kind of unhealthy, but there was also like a lot of counter play to that deck. When you talk about the Hitmonlees, when you talk about like the Darkrai Weaviles, the Gyarados decks, then there was the Meowscarada decks, and there was multiple versions of Meowscarada. I mean, when you look through this list of like the top 64, for example, I mean, it's just very diverse. I mean, from Palkia Vaporeon making another appearance, we had Rampardos, a deck that I was very high on, and continuing to perform. You even saw Leafeon pop up, which is crazy because Leafeon completely fell off pretty much after release, and a lot of people kind of wrote it off. But the decks that just were outside the cut, I mean, there was a Wugtrio Palkia deck. Charizard continues to become a deck that you see in the Ursiiday Pocket Weekly as well, which is kind of funny. It could be no other tournament is like seeing Charizard, but for some reason, the Ursiiday community continues to just jam Charizard. And hey, it is worth noting that I believe the only Charizard deck in the top 64, if I remember correctly, it actually played the Apex Charizard. But it did play the brand new Charmander and Charmeleon, so like that makes sense. But let's take a look at the breakdown of the metagame as well. When you talk about the breakdown of this metagame, Giratina Darkrai was the most popular deck by a considerable margin. Then you had Gallade Hitmonlee, which again, like going into this format, I actually really thought that Rampardos would be something that we would see a lot of. And although Rampardos was in the top 5 most played decks, the preferred fighting deck right now for the majority of players is Gallade. And like that's super interesting because Gallade kind of never made a splash on its release. However, when the meta kind of changed over into the past couple of sets, we've seen a lot of Gallade. Gyarados has been doing very well in some of the other tournaments, so it makes a lot of sense that people were playing Gyarados and Manaphy. The one thing that kind of like stood out to me is that like when fighting decks are popular, usually Gyarados is not so great because it's just kind of like hard to win a game whenever your Magikarp just keeps getting sniped by Hitmonlee. But that didn't deter people from bringing it. We saw Dialga and Arceus continue to be a factor, although it did have the lowest win percentage when you talk about like the top 10 decks, right? So even though I had a really good win percentage with it in ranked, there's a lot of reasons why that deck isn't necessarily doing so hot right now, although it did take up a few spots in the top cut, which we'll take a look at that here in just a moment as well. Then you had, Rampardos, you had Weavile Darkrai, you had 18 trainer Articuno, which is fascinating to me. You actually saw more Articuno 18 trainer than Palkia 18 trainer, even though that was the deck that I was jamming in rank 2. So like, I don't know, like it's fascinating. But again, a lot of cool decks. Giratina Mewtwo did take up a pretty significant portion of like decks played, and it did have a 62 win percent. That's insane, right? Like we're talking about like Gyarados type numbers from the first time that we saw Gyarados way back in Mythical Island. We're talking about Dialga Arceus numbers from the first time that, the first weekend that deck saw play. So when you talk about like dominant decks coming out and performing. The Giratina Darkrai deck kind of underperformed, but Giratina Mewtwo did very well for its kind of first appearance on like the big tournament stage of like 900 plus people. So again, a lot of cool decks here, and let's kind of talk about some of these individual decks as well. This was the first place finisher, and I do have some cool questions that I was able to go ahead and ask them about some of the card choices. If you remember when we were cooking this deck on stream, we really thought that playing 2 Mewtwo EXs was the move, and also we thought playing 2 Dawn was the move. It turns out that honestly you would rather start Giratina and just kind of be able to have that first turn ramp, and then eventually Mewtwo kind of cleans things up in a lot of ways, but the deck can get away with starting Mewtwo. But you can see by the 2-1 ratio that you definitely want to start Giratina as opposed to the Mewtwo. When you take a look at the rest of the trainers, Red has been phenomenal since it's come out. I think it's probably one of the most impactful supporters that we've seen. Probably not as impactful as something like a Cyrus, right? Cyrus is just like warped the meta, right? But Red is definitely up there in terms of like one of the best supporters that we've seen. I'd probably put it up there with Leaf, right? Then when you take a look at some of the other supporters, you got Pokemon Center Lady, you got Mars, you got 1 Rocky Helmet, 2 Giant Cape, 2 Potion, and then 2 Pokeballs. So the Pokemon Center Lady also made an appearance. And hey, maybe that's something that could be addressed as to maybe playing a different card. But there's a lot of good things going on with this deck, and it turned out to be very strong. In terms of the play pattern, you just want to ramp your Giratina and then hopefully, kind of slowly build up that Mewtwo as your energy attached per turn. And then you want to be able to basically sweep with a combination of Giratina and Mewtwo in whatever order happens. The Dawn can be sort of used as like a extra push to maybe close out a game. And then the 1 Leaf is there to allow you to pivot a little bit easier. So pretty straightforward deck. And if you're trying to figure out like what EX deck to go ahead and pick up, Giratina is probably the most versatile EX, and it may be as powerful as Arceus was when you talk about just individual card comparisons. The one thing that I would say about Giratina compared to Arceus, for example, is that you really need Dialga in a lot of ways to make Arceus as dominant as it is, but Giratina can work with a lot of different things. Like Giratina is a very cool toolbox card, so I would probably lean towards Giratina EX if you were like in a rush to try to use that deck token, which I know a lot of you probably already have. But again, that would probably be where I would lean. The other deck, we got a few decks that we're going to go over. So another deck was played by Sneak. This was the Giratina Darkrai deck. They did play 1 Shaman. So this is a cool little deck, and they did very well with it, right? Like all of these decks are from the top 64. So this was a deck that finished, I believe, in the top 4, if I remember correctly. But again, just kind of breaking down this deck, you can see the 1 Healing Shaman, and that's like a really interesting card. Instead of playing Potion, which you've seen a lot of these Darkrai, Druddigon, Giratina decks play, that chose to play Shaman. Then when you take a look at the rest of the trainers, the other thing that stands out is only 1 Leaf, which is something that, when you're talking about trying to counter this deck, sometimes like double Sabrina is a very good thing to play against with this deck, or play against this deck, and seeing 1 Leaf in this deck kind of opens up that door to that double Sabrina gameplay. However, it does kind of get negated if they have double Druddigon. The rest of the deck, double Giant Cape, 1 Rocky Helmet, 1 Sabrina, 1 Cyrus, 1 Mars. I mean, it's going to feel a lot like, in terms of trainers and like kind of like how you use the Shaman, it's going to feel a lot like Arceus Dialga, but just like different cards, right? In terms of like the Pokemon with Druddigon, Darkrai, and Giratina. But a very strong deck. A lot of people are using this to climb in ranked as well. Another deck list that really stood out when looking at the top 64 is this deck from Awa. This is going to be Meowscarada with a 1-1-1 lineup of the Beedrill line. And what's fascinating about this deck is that, when you take a look at this deck in terms of like the actual image of the deck, basically what I would say stood out to me is that If you've played Beedrill 14 Trainer, the one thing that you notice is like it's not often that you go through two different Beedrills, right? A lot of the time, one Beedrill is just going to win or lose you the game. So this deck strategy is basically get out that Meowscarada against those EX decks, and maybe Beedrill is kind of your closer more than anything. You've got that one Team Rocket Grunt, which is another trend that I've seen in some of these 14 Trainer decks as well with Beedrill. You've got the one the one Giant Cape. You got double Pokeball. You got one Pokecoms, double Red, double Erica, and again the rest of it is pretty self-explanatory. But again, really cool deck. The big question is like, what's the best partner for Meowscarada? And like, if you're gonna play an EX, you probably want to try to line up a 1-1-2 game as often as possible. The trainers don't have any switch cards in terms of like a Sabrina or Cyrus, so that's a little concerning, considering, you know, it may be hard to one-shot in some matchups. But honestly, this deck did very well, and you know, there has to be more to it. So really cool deck, and there's like multiple Meowscarada variants. So we're still trying to figure out like what's the best Meowscarada partner, and hey, maybe Beedrill is a contender. The Gallade deck that we saw, and I believe this is getting towards like the top 16. I may be mistaken. I don't remember exactly where this finished, but I know it's top 64. But this is a variant of Gallade. This Gallade deck is something that a lot of people are choosing to use to climb in ranked as well. So if you're trying to figure out like, can I use these tournament decks to climb in ranked? Yes, it's 100% possible. The matchups are pretty sweet as well. If you check out on PokemonMeta.com, you can actually see win rates for some of these decks and kind of like see good matchups, bad matchups. But just breaking this deck down, double Hitmonlee, one Marshadow. I know that that's something that's being debated in the community. Like, for example, Raven prefers Sudowoodo over Marshadow. And a lot of it stems from like the 2 energy cost, right, for the attack. One Rocky Helmet, so you know you're not going to see Rocky Helmet like very often, but hopefully when you do, it's impactful. Double Cyrus to synergize with the Hitmonlee. One Iona, which is a card that you are seeing more often in these Stage 2 decks. One Pokecom, and it's like we talked about in that stream where we broke down the newest set. That 1-1 split Iona to Pokecoms really solid, and then you see the one Mars for a little bit of disruption or a potential card or a comeback card, and then one red. The next deck that we'll take a look at is going to be the Manaphy and Gyarados deck. This was piloted by Fryrish19. So this is going to have a lot of similarities to some other water decks that we've seen playing a Stage 1 alongside Manaphy. But you've got that Origin Form Palkia and Manaphy. You're trying to line up a 1-1-2 game where, hey, maybe they have to go through Manaphy, then Origin Form Palkia, and then Gyarados is kind of like their final boss, which can definitely work. And again, this deck had been performing very well in other tournaments, and I think that's a big reason why a lot of people chose to bring this. And this also does follow the trend of like a water deck that doesn't have to depend on Misty, but can definitely win games when you high roll with Misty. And so like that's something to also pay attention to. One Pokecoms to try to find your Gyarados a little bit more consistently. One Sabrina, no Cyrus, but double Arita, double Misty, one red. And red is basically taking the place of like Druddigon, Druddigon and Greninja in terms of getting that extra 20 damage. And the thing to kind of point out too with red in this deck is that, you know, before we were playing Greninja, we were playing Druddigon, we were trying to find ways to get that 20 damage to make Gyarados do 160. And like the thing is, a lot of those times that you needed to do 160 was against an EX Pokemon. And so that's why red has been able to really just slide right into these Gyarados decks. Now, granted, this person's only playing one. Maybe you can make the argument for playing two, but again, you can't argue with the results, right? And then the double Rocky Helmet can also help you get that 160 damage on point. This was the breakdown of the top 64, and basically 17 Giratina Darkrais made it into the top cut, which it was the most played deck, so that kind of makes a lot of sense. Gallade and Hitmonlee took up 8 spots, Gyarados took up 8 spots, Giratina Mewtwo took up 7 spots, and then from there you kind of slim down the numbers. But we're still seeing some of the older decks do pretty well. Dialga Arceus, Weavile Darkrai still doing pretty well. You still see Rampardos in here. You've got Darkrai Ninja making an appearance. You still see the Genetic Apex Charizard making an appearance. So this is like very diverse, and I know that like a lot of people, like I said, don't love that Dredagon play pattern, but it's really interesting, and this may be just the beginning of the format, and so like that's why it might be so diverse. Maybe in like 2 weeks or so the meta looks a lot more like streamlined, but the good thing is like we have a new set coming out by the end of April, so like the meta is going to change again. So I love the fast pace of the game and how often the meta changes, like week to week, tournament to tournament, and then also like you get a bunch of new cards. But I definitely hear people's feedback where, oh my gosh, there's another set coming out, how am I gonna have the hourglasses, etc., etc. The good thing is I do think that the game has been pretty friendly to players who don't want to spend a lot, or players that don't want to spend at all. And then for the players that do want to spend, I mean, you're able to get almost all the decks very soon within the first 2 days of the new set. So again, very diverse meta right now, a lot of different decks in the top 64. And hey, that's something that's pretty cool to see, especially when you start talking about like, man, that the Executor raid boss part of the meta was like awful to really play in, and so like it's good to see a diverse meta like this. And although you may not like Dredagon, at least that there's healthy counters to it. But let's get into this interview with the first place finisher right now. This was first place finisher, also known as M-Forced CM2. They go by Christian on Discord, so that's why the name looks different. But let's talk about this interview. Basically, I started off by asking, what made them bring Giratina and Mewtwo to the tournament? And they kind of stated that they had seen that this deck had some success in some previous tournaments, along with the fact that being able to play the Psychic Energy gets you basically 2 energy per turn on your Giratina, and that's very good. But using Mewtwo as opposed to Darkrai also allowed you to get a little bit more of a higher damage, right? That extra damage of 150 compared to the often on Darkrai pings that you can get. But again, like all of those factors led to them trying this out, and they said, hey, why not give it a try? The next part that I asked them about was that the decision to run 1 Mewtwo as opposed to 2, and the fact that like that was something that I hadn't thought of, right? Like I didn't think about that when we were making this deck on stream before the set came out. And also I thought that 2 Dawns was the best thing to do with this deck. But also Judy has apparently changed their build as well and gone to 1 Dawn, so it seems like 1 Dawn is the move with this deck. So if you're trying to cook with this deck, I definitely think 1 Dawn is the way to go, and it makes a lot of sense, especially if Giratina is supposed to be your primary attacker. But what did you think about your trainers? Is there anything you would change after the tournament run? They said, I don't think you need 2 Mewtwo's. Mainly, you want Giratina to ramp while Mew is benched. I did feel like it might be more beneficial to run 2 helmets instead of 1 because the 20 could go a long way. And the hills helped as well, maybe not the Pokemon Center Lady as much, and then they were thinking about running 2 Dawns, but having 1 seems to be enough. They also thought about the idea of blue, so that's something to kind of think with. Maybe you want to cook with that, but let's keep going with this interview. So again, with Giratina being the main focus, I definitely agree 1 Dawn is definitely the best route. Were there any matchups that stood out to you through your testing or your tournament run? They said not really, other than if you go first and only have Mewtwo, it could slow you down a decent bit. At times, when you don't have Leaf, I kind of held off playing things on my bench because of the possible Sabrina, which would also slow you down. So like that kind of like speaks to what I mentioned earlier in the video about seeing some lists with only 1 Leaf and how they can be a little bit more vulnerable to the double Sabrina kind of choice with supporters. Also, there was a lot of different supporters, so I really had to think what was the best play, when to do this and that. So you can kind of get a glimpse into their brain in terms of like play patterns and whatnot. I said red has definitely had a big impact when it comes to supporters. We also got ranked recently. Do you think this deck can have success in ranked, and can this deck keep up its success in other tournaments? I do believe this deck can have success in ranked. Before I did this tourney, I was using this deck in ranked and got up to Ultra Ball. So there's a little bit of proof that, hey, there is a little bit of carryover from a tournament deck to ranked in this example. That's not always the case, but in this case, definitely going to be the truth. Since then, it's been up and down, but I still believe this deck will be successful and ranked in future tournaments. But with every meta deck, there is a counter, which I would believe to be Darkrai Weavile or Gallade. So there's a little bit more motivation for the Darkrai Weevil or Weavile believers, as well as the Gallade believers, and a little bit of an insight into like how they're already starting to consider like the counters to this deck as the pilots of this deck. I said there would definitely be a target on the deck, and I can imagine Meowscarada could be a card that gives this deck problems, Rampardos as well, or maybe just like a 1-point deck that we haven't seen so much. Again, as far as shout outs, people that they wanted to recognize, they said they wanted to thank Ursiiday, wanted to thank all the mods for this tournament and everyone else who was involved for a fun time. So a really cool, wholesome interview, a little bit of insight into ranked, a little bit of insight into possible counters for this deck. And I think that that's one of the big reasons why these interviews are so cool to bring to you guys. And again, I can't thank you all enough for watching. I hope you hit that button that says follow/subscribe. You can also click the logo at the bottom right of the video. That would subscribe you as well. But let me know what you think about the meta right now. What are your thoughts on the meta? Let me know in the comments. What are some decks that maybe we're sleeping on? And again, thank you for taking time out of your day for me to be background noise. Maybe it's entertaining, or hey, maybe you learned something. And until next time, peace.